Discernment and choice of connections question. In life, everything is determined by discernment. In order to make proper discernments, we must first begin with the discernment of relationships and connections. Even when purchasing an item, it involves conversations with people. However, discerning connections is difficult and exhausting. How can we cultivate the ability to discern relationships effectively? Answer: the connections that come into my life today are precisely the result of the situations I have created. Let's first examine negative connections. If a thief enters my home, it is because I created an environment that allowed the thief to come. A thief will never cross the threshold unless the conditions are set for them to do so. This is an unchanging law of nature. The same principle applies to all aspects of life. For example, if a swindler approaches me, it is because I have created an environment where such a person can come into my life. It is not simply because the swindler acted that I am harmed. Rather, the conditions I established allowed such a person to approach me. Now, do these thieves and swindlers cause great harm from the very beginning? Not necessarily. If we fail to recognize smaller warnings, larger ones will follow. If we do not learn from these experiences, the consequences will continue to escalate until we lose everything. The same principle applies to spiritual teachings. In Buddhism, when someone initially makes a mistake, they may be instructed to bow 3 times. If they do not correct themselves, they may be asked to bow 8 times, then 108 times, and eventually even 3,000 times. The process escalates gradually. Similarly, when a thief comes into our lives, it is an opportunity to reflect on our own mistakes. If we become angry and resentful towards the thief, dwelling on the incident for too long, we are likely to attract an even greater theft in the future. The same applies to being deceived. If we hold onto our resentment, the loss will only grow. The sooner we learn from these experiences, the better. When we first experience theft, we may be confused. However, instead of simply blaming the thief, we should reflect on our own actions. Did I leave this item in a vulnerable place for too long? If we understand this, we can take corrective measures rather than letting the cycle continue. The law of energy movement in nature. The laws of energy movement exist in nature. If I harbor negative thoughts or impure energy, it will inevitably influence my environment. For example, let's say I have a small piece of gold and store it in my wardrobe. If the gold's energy mass is suited for 7 months, it will remain undisturbed for that duration. However, after 7 months, its energy will begin to shift, and it will attract movement. How does this movement occur? It does not physically move on its own, yet a thief will somehow find and take it. Thieves have a keen spiritual sensitivity that guides them directly to such objects. If security measures prevent thieves from entering, then someone within the household, perhaps even one's own child, may end up taking the item. This is because energy always moves. So how can we prevent theft? The answer is simple: periodically move the object. If I move the gold from the wardrobe to another location, I reset the energy cycle and buy time. By shifting its location every 6 months, I prevent it from attracting a thief. This principle applies to all energy movement, unused objects, stagnant money, and even relationships. If an object has a larger energy mass, such as a high-value possession, it should be placed in a secure vault. If its energy mass is 3 years, it may remain safe in a vault for that time. However, if I do not touch or check it for 3 years, it will inevitably attract a skilled thief. This is the law of energy movement. Energy always moves. The principle of spending money wisely. If we are given financial resources, we must use them wisely. For example, if you have $100,000, the best way to use it is to spend 30% wisely. This means using $30,000 meaningfully. When you do this, a space equivalent to 30% is created, and the natural energy movement will fill it back up. This occurs because the remaining 70% creates a pull that attracts the missing 30%. However, if you spend 70% and expect the remaining 30% to be replenished, it will not happen. In fact, regaining that 30% will be extremely difficult because the pull is insufficient. A similar principle applies to the human liver. If 30% of the liver is removed, it will regenerate. However, if 70% is removed, survival becomes uncertain. This is an example of the 3 to 7 energy principle, which governs nature. The 3 to 7 rule in human relationships. When we interact with others, we must also apply the 3 to 7 rule. If I dedicate 100% effort to a relationship and provide 30% constructive criticism, the other person will accept my words. However, if I criticize without first showing care and effort, my words will bounce back at me, creating conflict. Energy moves in relationships as well. If we try to give unsolicited advice to someone who is not ready to receive it, it will backfire and cause us trouble. This is why understanding natural laws is essential. The law of positive connections. Now, let's talk about how to attract positive relationships. The quality of the people who enter our lives is determined by our own efforts. If we live recklessly, we will attract negative influences. On the other hand, if we cultivate good thoughts and words, we will attract positive people, not because we are inherently good, but because of the effort we put in. Success in forming good relationships is not about what we achieve, but about how much effort we put into self-improvement. Nature does not reward accomplishments alone, it observes our attempts to overcome our shortcomings. If we do not make any effort, positive things will not happen, and good relationships will not come our way. For instance, if we live diligently and contribute to society, nature will grant us good children and favorable circumstances. Conversely, if we live irresponsibly, we may receive difficult relationships that challenge us to change. Everything in nature is influenced by our own mindset and actions. We do not adapt to nature, rather, our choices shape the natural forces that respond to us. Final thoughts. The power of self-responsibility. All relationships and environmental influences originate from within us. This is why blaming others is futile. The principle of energy movement teaches us that blaming others only leads to more hardship. If we understand this truth, we can still choose to blame others, but we must be prepared to face the consequences. Our challenges are ours alone to bear, and they are not caused by anyone else. A true teacher first teaches the correct way to live before offering help. Understanding these laws is the first step to creating a life of harmony and balance. Thus, the law of relationships dictates that we shape our environment, attract our connections, and determine our fate. Discernment and choice of connections. Question. In life, everything is determined by discernment, judgment. To make the right judgments, one must first begin with discerning relationships and connections. Even when purchasing an item, it involves conversations with people. However, discerning relationships is not easy. So, how can we develop the ability to discern connections properly? 1. Connections come from the environment we create. The connections that come into my life today are a result of the environment I have created. Examples of negative connections. 1. If a thief enters my home, it is because I have created an environment that allows a thief to come in. 2. If I encounter a swindler, it is because I have set the conditions that attract such a person. 3. These situations do not escalate suddenly. Initially, small incidents occur. If we fail to recognize and correct them, they grow into bigger problems. If we continue to ignore them, we may eventually lose everything. Solution. 1. When a negative connection appears, resentment and anger will only attract similar situations again. 2. Instead, we should reflect on our environment and correct the underlying causes. 2. The law of nature. Energy always moves, everything carries energy, and energy is always in motion, it never remains still. Example, energy movement and theft. 1. If I store a piece of gold in a wardrobe, it remains untouched for a certain period based on its energy mass. However, when that time has passed, its energy shifts, and it attracts movement. A thief, who is subconsciously drawn to energy, will find and take it. If the house is too secure for a thief to enter, a family member may end up taking it instead. This is because energy must always move. How to prevent theft? 1. Move the object periodically. By changing its location every 6 months, the energy resets and prevents attraction. This principle applies not only to objects but also to stagnant money and relationships. 2. For valuable items, store them in a secure vault. However, if left untouched for 3 years, a more skilled thief will eventually come for it. This is the law of energy movement. Energy is always in motion. 3. The law of economy, the 3 to 7 principle. To use financial resources wisely, one must circulate energy properly. How to spend money wisely. 1. Use 30% of your money meaningfully, and the remaining 70% will naturally attract new energy. 2. However, if you spend 70% and leave only 30%, replenishing it becomes much more difficult. This principle also applies to the human body. 1. If 30% of the liver is removed, it regenerates naturally. 2. If 70% is removed, survival becomes difficult. 3. This is why we must maintain at least 70% and circulate only 30% for sustainability. 4. The 3 to 7 rule in human relationships. 1. If I invest 100% effort into a relationship, I can give up to 30% constructive advice, and it will be accepted. 2. However, if I criticize without making an effort first, the other person will resist and retaliate. 3. Thus, the quality of relationships depends on how much sincere effort we put into them. 5. How to attract positive connections. The quality of the connections in our lives depends on our own efforts. 1. Good connections do not come simply because we are good people. 2. It is about the effort we make to improve ourselves. 3. If we recognize our shortcomings and work to improve, good connections naturally follow. 4. Conversely, a reckless and irresponsible lifestyle will attract negative connections. Example: parent-child relationships. 1. If I live righteously, my child will be a good connection who supports me. 2. However, if I live irresponsibly, I may have difficulties with my child, which will teach me lessons through hardship. 6. Everything starts with me. 1. All relationships and circumstances originate from my choices and actions. 2. Blaming others will only lead to more hardships. 3. Nature does not change us, we change ourselves, and nature responds accordingly. Conclusion. 1. If we want good relationships, we must first look inward and change ourselves. 2. The root cause of all connections and circumstances is me. 3. When we stop blaming others and take responsibility, both our relationships and environment will improve. The law of connections. Jihoon always found meeting people burdensome. Whether at work or in his personal life, he tried to maintain a safe distance from others. But after that day, his perception of human relationships completely changed. One day, his manager, Mr. Yoon, quietly called him into his office. Jihoon, there's an important rule in human relationships. Have you ever heard of the 3 to 7 rule? Jihoon shook his head. Mr. Yoon smiled and continued. When giving advice, if you've put in 100% effort into a relationship, you should only offer about 30% of your advice. That way, the other person will accept it. If you give 100% criticism without making any effort in the relationship, you'll only face resistance. Those words lingered in Jihoon's mind. He wanted to form good relationships, but he often felt distant from people. After reflecting on it, he realized that he often gave advice and criticism without genuinely caring about others. From that day on, he decided to experiment. He paid more attention to conversations with colleagues and was more cautious when giving his opinions. Applying the rule in real life, his first opportunity came during a conversation with his colleague, Suman. She was struggling with a project. In the past, Jihoon would have bluntly given a solution. But this time, he did things differently. Suman, you seem a bit stressed these days. Are you okay? She looked surprised. Oh, actually, yes. This project is harder than I expected. I see. Is there anything I can help with? Suman hesitated for a moment before speaking. Honestly, revising the proposal has been the most challenging part. I think your past experience might be helpful. Only then did Jihoon carefully offer his opinion. From what I see, it might work better if approached slightly differently. I have some materials from a previous project. Would you like to look at them together? Suman's face brightened. That would really help. Thank you so much. From that day on, Jihoon applied the 3 to 7 rule more diligently. The more effort he put into his relationships, the more receptive people became to his advice, and his interactions became smoother. Mending an old friendship, however, there was still one unresolved matter: his longtime friend, Jae-sok. They had been close since high school, but over the past few years, they had grown apart. The reason was simple. Jihoon always gave Jae-sok too much advice, and Jae-sok found it overwhelming. One day, Jihoon gathered his courage and met Jae-sok. Jae-sok, do you think we could be like we used to be? Jae-sok tilted his head slightly. Maybe, if you give me less advice. Ji-hoon let out a wry smile. Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. From now on, I'll try to listen to you more. Jae-sok remained silent for a moment before letting out a chuckle. Alright, let's give it a try. To be honest, your advice was often helpful. But sometimes, I just wanted you to listen. And sir, their friendship slowly began to mend. A positive transformation as time passed, Ji-hoon built better relationships with more people. Whether at work or among friends, he became a more trusted and respected person. One day, Mr. Yoon called him again. Things seem to be changing a lot. People are starting to seek your advice. Ji-hoon smiled. Yes, thanks to learning about the 3 to 7 rule from you, Mr. Yoon nodded in approval. That's the key to forming good relationships. Keep applying it well. That evening, Ji-hoon gazed out the window, deep in thought. Connections ultimately depend on how I behave. Determined to continue applying the 3 to 7 rule, he resolved to build even better relationships in the future.